Our second shir this evening, we have Rabbi Ulman live with us from Sydney. We're honored to have Rabbi Yehoram Ulman, an expert in matters of contemporary halacha. This evening, Rabbi Ulman has been kind enough to join us to discuss if DNA can determine Jewish identity. He's also mentioned that he'll be kind enough to take some questions at the end of the shir. So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to hold it to the end. Rabbi Ulman will be happy to answer at that point.
Yeah, a good Woche, everybody. Thank you very much, Reb Shlomo, for the opportunity. Now it's a whole different, together with all of the Corona situation. You know, I remember a couple of years ago, I came in person, but now we have this opportunity to have people at the comfort of the homes, still learning Torah. The topic tonight that I'm speaking about is whether one can use DNA to certify Jewish status. So it goes without saying that the premise of our talk is that for us, it's absolutely crucial to establish Jewish status for the purpose of Jewish continuity, especially when we're coming to a question of a chasna, of a Jewish wedding. It's something which was always, today it's in most organized communities, you have a system. Before a couple comes to get married, they have to go through Birur Yuchsin, which part of it is to establish Jewish status. Not only that, because it also establishes other questions of Yuchsin, such as Kehuna and Chalitza and Mamzeris, and many other questions that have to be taken care of before one gets married. But obviously, it's imperative that both the Chosen and the Kala have to be Jewish. And the definition of a Jew was established. Now, last week was Shavuos, so at Matan Torah was established that Miyahu Yehudi, that a Jew is somebody either born from a Jewish mother or was Nisgair according to Halacha. Can you ask them to talk? Those are the two definitions of Jewish status. And the question of who is a Jew is not determined by how a person feels. Sometimes it's possible that a person may he was kidnapped from his family, Tindik Shenishba, and he's growing up in an environment he has no idea that is Jewish, and nevertheless, Lapi Halacha, he's a Yid, whether he knows or not. And at the same time, if a frum couple adopt a Jewish child, adopt a non-Jewish child, even though the child from a youngest age is growing up in that family, but at the same time, unless they convert him, the child is not Jewish. So it's not determined by how a person identifies oneself, but it's determined according to the way a person is, what his neshama is the Jewish neshama is in him if his mother is Jewish or he is Nisgair according to halacha. So this is our premise. And the question is, you know, until now we used many different methods to establish Jewish status. Chazaka means a presumption. If somebody is a known family, and we know that he comes from a Frum family, for example, and his parents are Jewish, his grandmother is Jewish, and so on and so forth. So we you know, there's a chazaka of being Jewish. There's a question of documents that prove one's Jewishness, and with every single community, one has to know which documents to use in order to be able to identify Jewish status. It's not the same among Russian Jews, or Hungarian Jews, or American Jews, or, for example, South African and English or British. Because, for example, in most Russian Jews didn't have ksubas. You have to know which documents to rely upon, how to be able to distinguish and to recognize a ziyuf, a forgery in a document. And that is something which is a separate subject on the actual expertise, both halachic and metziastic, because metzias is also part of halacha, to be able to determine Jewish status. Inevitably, there are situations that come up that a particular person comes up and he or she identifies themselves as being Jewish. And ultimately, there's not enough evidence to be able to certify them as such. And the question which we're discussing today, can we use the cutting-edge science of DNA to be able to help, to assist in certifying one's Jewishness? So everybody knows that DNA is a very unique genetic code embedded in every cell. And already for quite a number of years, discussions take place among poskim. How can we use DNA for different areas in halacha, to establish fatherhood, for Yerushas, for Mamzeres? We've written about a question why we don't actually test to disqualify somebody to make somebody a mamzer, why we don't use DNA to do that. When it came to agunas, for example, after Yom Kippur War, almost 1,000 agunas were saved, but then they couldn't use DNA. But when it came to the Twin Towers, DNA was used to be able to matir agunas. So today we won't talk about agunas. We're not going to talk about Yerusha or Mamzeres. We'll talk about specifically Jewish status. So when it comes to Jewish status, there is a regular DNA that everybody has. And that DNA cannot be used for establishing Jewish status, because every single one of us, from the moment that the female egg is being fertilized and inseminated, it creates an embryo, an embryo creates a fetus, and a fetus creates a child. This child, from the very beginning of being an embryo, is a product of his father and his mother. And his mother is a product of her father and her mother. And therefore, by the time you come to a genetic results of one's DNA, it's impossible to tell if one is halachically Jewish. It became very popular today. People test, there's different programs, there's Ancestry and 23andMe and Family Finder. And people come up and say, I was tested, I'm 87% Ashkenazi Jew. That cannot be admissible in a Beis Din, because at least not for the only certification. Because like I said before, it could be that you're 87% Ashkenazi Jew, but one mother many generations ago wasn't Jewish, and afterwards they all married Jews, but ultimately you're not Jewish. Again, it doesn't mean that you are not Jewish, because somebody could have come from Gerim, but it certainly couldn't certify one as being Jewish. I'm saying that from Gerim, if the DNA is completely not Jewish, for example. There's one exception. The exception is what we call mitochondrial DNA. What is mitochondria? Mitochondria is a minuscule part of every cell. Let's take, for example, the female egg. The female egg it's a larger cell in the human body. It contains approximately 3 billion letters of DNA. And within that female egg, there's a minuscule part called mitochondria. And mitochondria has approximately 16,500 letters of DNA. And this mitochondria is passed from a mother to sons and daughters, but it can only go further from the daughters. It can go from sons. It self-destructs with males. So in theory, if a person's mitochondria is matched to a Jewish lady that lived 1,000 years ago, in theory, that person is Jewish. The question is, how do you practically use it? So the science of mitochondria started to be developed, especially within the context of Jewish community, and how to be able to find families that are exclusively Jewish. And specifically within Ashkenazi community, the ability to locate and identify such families was very successful. And already a couple of years ago, they found specifically 4 families we call them symbolically the 4 primordial mothers that are exclusively Jewish. And if we can match a certain amount of Jewish people to those mothers, then we can identify them as Jewish scientifically. So in the end of 2016, there was a small conference which was organized in Eretz Yisrael, and it was specifically very small. I'll explain to you why. And this conference was specifically to discuss how we can use mitochondrial DNA to establish Jewish status. This conference was the Ma'areach, the host, was Professor Steinberg in his quarters, and the rabbis who were invited was Abzal Nechemia Goldberg, who was one of the leading poskim in our times. He was invited because his opinion is very much respected in all areas of halacha. And then there were maybe 3 other rabbonim invited. It was Rabbi Birnbaum from Moscow, who was a guy in Moscow, was very, very active in this area. A good friend of mine, Rabbi Litka, who is a very big expert in the area of Even Ezer, anything to do with Yuchsin and those areas. Yuchsin means Jewish statuses in Jewish law. And myself and 3 of the leading scientists in this area. One of them is Professor Karol Skoretsky, who found the famous Cohen gene, even though he's the first person to say that the Cohen gene cannot be used for halacha, to identify Kohanim. But he is famous for that particular breakthrough finding in science. A few months before this conference, I received a phone call from a young lady from United States of America. And this lady is from a very famous rabbinical family. You know, the family is, you know, her great-grandfather was a very famous Rav in Russia. He was killed by Stalin, Bal Mesiras Nefesh from Hasidim and Anshe Ma'aseh, a very, very well-known family. And she called me with the following problem. She says that she herself comes from a family of many siblings, and one of her brothers, unfortunately, completely abandoned Jewish practice, and he became what they call a Western humanist. In other words, he's not specifically, he's not an atheist, he believes in God, but he believes all men are equal and there's no need to be Jewish. And he moved to a small shtetl in Northern Europe, and he married a Catholic Polish girl, and she's pregnant with a child, and the family basically cut off from him. The only one that is still connected to him is that particular sister. And I actually encouraged her, you know, we can't judge how families react to any particular situation, but with her, she asked me if she should continue the connection with her sister-in-law, and I said, with the brother, I said definitely she should, but the rest of the family sort of stopped any contact. And she says that in one of the conversations with her sister-in-law, the Polish girl told her that there is some rumor in a family that they have some Jewish blood a few generations ago. And right away, you know, when a person is grasping at straws, they want to hear something, she right away should...
It's pretty good. Yeah, I mean,
and she right away said to her, tell me more, I want to hear about your Jewish connection. She said, look, I'm going to call my mother, I'm going to ask her. She called her mother in the city of Krakow. Her parents still live in Poland. And her mother tells her, listen, we are not Jewish, we Catholics, we're Polish, leave it alone. She says, look, I want to be polite to my sister-in-law, please tell me what you know. So she told a little bit that the great-grandmother's parents were a couple called Clara and Isidore Robinson, who lived in Odessa. And the rumor goes that they're Jewish, that's what they know. So the sister-in-law asked me if I can do what's called a Birur Yuchsin, if I can open up a file and see if we can come to any conclusion about the Jewish status of her Polish Catholic sister-in-law. I said, look, she has to agree to go through this Birur. She says, yeah, I'll talk to her. So it's interesting that the Jewish brother wasn't so interested. He didn't want his wife to be interrogated. But the girl herself became very curious. And she says that she's happy to talk to me and go through a birur. And I spoke to a number of times. We established a file, a very, very thick file. And basically, I wanted to connect all of the maternal members of the family, in other words, her mother, her grandmother, great-grandmother, to that particular couple, Clara and Isidore Robinson. And she was able to get all the papers. And there was also some oral evidence which wasn't documented. For example, they said that the great-grandmother's maiden name was Vorhaft, and they also said that, you know, she had 7 children. One child is Leon, went to America, and only one other was known, which is the great-grandmother of our girl that we're talking about. And we also got some other circumstantial evidence. There was a non-Jewish neighbor who, by the time he spoke to me, by the time he was able to talk to me, he wasn't very coherent and everything else. And but the evidence that he gave before was that when the family moved to Krakow from Odessa, they knew that they were Jewish, and people liked them, neighbors liked them, and they didn't give them up to Nazis. They didn't betray them to Nazis. So we had a file that thick, you know, all the evidence, all the documents, but it wasn't enough to certify her. With names, a name like Robinson, it's not a Shem Muvak. It's a name that very possibly could be Jewish in Eastern Europe. In Western Europe, in England, it's a typical non-Jewish name. So there's certain names which are Shemes Muvhakim, which means like it's almost like an endemic names to like a name like Cohen or Levi. That's a typical Jewish name. A name like Goldberg or Weiss or Schwarz depends where. In Eastern Europe, it's inevitably Jewish. But in Western Europe, like when you go to Germany, there could be a lot of non-Jewish people with those names. But the name Robinson was one of those names that could go either way. But this is already some kind of a hint. So I suggested to the sister-in-law, I said, look, I'm going to this conference in Eretz Yisrael. When I'll come back, I'm going to tell you if I suggest that your sister-in-law should go through a mitochondrial DNA, she's a candidate for the mitochondrial DNA test. The conference was specifically very, very small because in Israel, everything becomes very political. As I will tell you a little bit later, it did become very political at the end, this question of using mitochondrial DNA to establish statuses. But first we listened to these scientists, and the scientists told us about those 4 primordial mothers. And they told us that the chances of somebody who's actually matched to one of those mothers, which at that time was about 45% of Ashkenazi Jews, specifically Ashkenazi Jews, because they had like a few families, and it was easier to find some kind of to categorize them. It was easier to be able to establish the contact. With Sephardi families, it was more complicated. They're working on it now. We'll tell you how later on how it moved since then. But at that time, specifically Ashkenazi families, you were able to match 45% of those 4 mothers. And the way the scientists explained to us was that scientifically it's virtually impossible. That even if you will take a non-Jewish person who has no prior chazaka, and he'll matched or she'll be matched to one of the 4 mothers, from their perspective, they were very polite and very respectful, and they didn't try to talk halacha to us, that's left to Rabbonim, but they said that as far as they're concerned, they think that it's virtually impossible. It's probably somebody that's a gishmad, somebody that converted to Christianity or something, but ultimately they think that he's on the mother's line, they're Jewish. But one of the things that became very clear, that if a person, for example, has only 30% evidence that they're Jewish, if they will be matched for mitochondrial DNA to one of the Jewish mothers, it goes to 99 something percent. That's how high it goes. It becomes virtually, it's never 100%, but it becomes almost 100% that they're Jewish. So when I came back to Australia, I told the sister-in-law in America that I think it's a good idea if her sister-in-law in Scandinavia will go through the mitochondrial DNA. But I told her that it doesn't mean if she'll be matched, it doesn't mean that she automatically will be certified as being Jewish. It's a very new area in halacha. And halacha doesn't work that as soon as you find some scientific argument, automatically you start using without any accountability or any kind of a proper due process. There has to be a situation where poskim agree to it, and it has to be something which is not just a one-off thing that is decided based on one test. But I suggested that it'll go a long way if she will do it. In order to do a test, it has to be under hashgacha. Anything to do with yuchsin cannot be done without supervision. It includes fertility processes. It includes even when we do a end-of-life issues, when we want to be able to make sure that a person is completely dead and do all the tests, conformatory test, a clinical test, there has to be always a independent hashgacha. But over here, especially, because here it's so easy to be able to do a swab from somebody else. So in order for this DNA to be admissible in Beis Din, it has to be under hashgacha. So to fly from Australia was very difficult, very complicated. So I've asked my colleague from Russia, who is only a couple of hours flight, Rabbi Birnbaum, to go to Sweden and to supervise the DNA test. And he agreed to go. By the time he was able to fly, he came 2 days before Yom Kippur. And she just gave birth to a baby girl. And she was happily did the swab. By that time, she was very curious, by the way. She did the swab. And it took, in those days, 2 months to get the results. Today it takes about a week and a half. Then it took about 2 months to get the results. And indeed, she was matched to one of the 4 mothers that we're speaking about, Ashkenazi mothers. At that time, I wrote a tshuva, which means a halachic responsum, to argue that I believe that Al Pi Halacha she is Jewish, even though I said I will not issue a psak until it'll become more accepted and until I will have it staffers from other, from Gdela Poskim and so on and so forth. But I wrote in my tshuva, I discussed different methods, halachic methods of establishing Jewish status, both from Chazal and that evolved from Chazal to become more practical law, because Chazal gave general ideas. For example, Chazoka, Roiv, Kavua, and different levels of both in Yisur V'Heter and in Yuchsin. But from there, it evolves into other simonim of Yiddishkeit, such as papers, such as English language, names, and so on and so forth. And then I spoke about how does mitochondrial DNA have a precedent in Shas and Poskim, because we know that in Yiddishkeit, it's not enough to have some scientific breakthrough. Every single thing, and I think that's one of the most important points of this particular lecture, of this talk, that everything that we talk about in all of the cutting-edge scientific questions in halacha must have sources in Shas and Poskim. So one of the main arguments that this particular tshuva was printed at the time in 2 places, was printed as a separate kuntras with a counter tshuva from Rabbi Osher Weiss, who at the time argued with me. Rabbi Osher Weiss is one of the very great poskim in our times. And he at the time didn't agree with my argument. And it was also printed in a very important publication on Evan Ezer called Oirech Mishpat. And the main argument, there's quite a few points one can bring in to show how mitochondrial DNA could be used from a halachic perspective. But the main argument, in my opinion, is as follows. We have in Hilchos Agunos, in Masechta Yevomis, and goes into Turun Shulchan Aruch, and after Shulchan Aruch into Nosei Kelim, into Farshim Shulchan Aruch, there is a famous question that the body is found. We know that Aguna is a woman. Today, we associate Agunas with women that, for some reason, the husband doesn't refuse to give them a get. But the main halachos of Agunas in those times, in olden times, was a typical example when a husband went to traveling or he went to war and he disappeared. And a woman is stuck because in order for her to remarry, there has to be at least one witness. The Chazal allowed one witness to testify that the husband is dead. And unless the husband is dead, she can't remarry. So they have a particular situation. A body is found. The body is disfigured. You can't really see that this is the husband. They have certain raglaim adover. They have certain reasons to believe it could be the husband, either the place or some kind of evidence that that's where he died. So there is some reason why they think it could be the husband. But ultimately, he can be identified. The wife comes along and she says, I have a siman, I have a sign that this is my husband. And she produces a sign. So the poskim discuss what kind of a sign you need, it goes from Shas into Rishonim and Achronim. What kind of a sign do you need in order to be able to change the status of this woman from being an Eishes Ish to being a Pnuya, which is really one of the most severe changes of status in Jewish law with the highest levels of consequences and ashlachas. So there are three types of signs. There's a weak sign, there's a siman beinani, which is an average sign, and a siman muvak, which means the most highly identifying sign. And while it's not enough to have a siman beinani, you need to have quite a few siman beinanim, average signs, but it's enough to have one siman muvak to change the status. And the question which is discussed, how rare the siman has to be. We know that if she comes along and says, look, he had some dirt on his fingernails, it could be every third person. So it's not enough to be able to give a sign that every 5, 10, even 100 people have. The consensus of most poskim is brought in Beis Shmuel in Eitzara Poskim that you need to have echad me'elef, 1 in 1,000. That's how rare it has to be in order to be able to change the status of a Eishes Ish, of a married woman, to a status of Pnuya, of a single woman. And what I argued was in my tshuva that it's a very comparable case on two levels. On one level is that the change of chazaka, change of status, is very comparable. I would venture to say that that's the two most severe changes of status is from being Eishes Ish, from being a married woman to become a Pnuya, to be a single woman, and a non-Jewish woman to become a Jewish woman. Those two are, in Jewish law will be from the most consequential and momentous changes of status. And I argue that mitochondria is at least echad me'elef. It's even more rare than 1 in 1,000. In other words, in order to be able, if you look at the statistics and genetics, as argued by scientists, and again, you know, obviously you have to be able to check a few times, and you have to make sure that there's no mistakes. That's all taken into account. But ultimately, if you do see that the mitochondrial DNA is matched to those families that are so scientifically identified as being Jewish, then it's definitely echad me'elef. It's definitely at least 1 in 1,000. That was my argument at the time. As I said before, Rabbi Osher Weiss wrote a counter tshuva, disagreeing, and I communicated to the family that while I really believe that she's Jewish, but we have to wait until we formally certify her. I said, I believe that you have to treat her as a Jew, but it'll take a bit of time, maybe not so long, but a bit of time to be able to come to a point where there'll be quite an agreement among many poskim that this is the case. In the meantime, I encouraged the sister-in-law. She was very talented, the Jewish one, the frum one, to be able to continue to dig into genealogy. She has a talent for looking for different lists and reshimas online. And indeed, it came first of all the father of the young man in Scandinavia, and the lady who contacted me called me up and he wanted to know more about it. I shared with him my view, and he said, he asked me if I'm ready to put out a psak. I said to him, look, when I put out a psak, I needed to be signed at least by 2 other poskim. And but in the meantime, I explained to him why I think that she is Jewish. And he said to me, look, I don't understand in percentages. When you're ready to write a psak, I don't need anybody else. I'm happy with your psak. But until such time, I'm not going to start communicating with them. I'll wait until you will certify them as such. A few months later, in Elul 2017, the Frum sister came across a website, a genealogical website, where there was the list of Odessa community in the late 19th century, from 1880. And it listed this couple, Clara and Isidore Robinson, as being a Jewish couple, with exactly the same surname, maiden name, as was the rumor, Warhaft. It also listed all the kids. We only knew 2 kids. We knew one which immigrated to America, and one is the great-grandmother of the girl we're dealing with. They had other names such as Yosef Shmuel and Matl, and all the kids are married under a chuppah. And it was quite irrefutable at this point that this couple was Jewish, and we had them all matched with all the documents that you needed. So I wrote an addition to my tshuva with all of the newly found facts, and a psak, a actual ruling that certifying this young lady as being Jewish. And at that point, the psak was signed by 5 other poskim, including Rabbi Osher Weiss, the same one argued against the original tshuva, by the chief Rabbi of Israel, Rabbi Lau, and by Rabbi Birnbaum, Rabbi Litka, and a couple of others. So it's, you know, it was a very, very like a breakthrough case, because until now, all of the experiments which they've done mostly were done on people they knew in advance what the results are going to be. It wasn't a surprise. This was one of the first, probably the first case when it started off with a lady who had no prior chazakah whatsoever, didn't think she was Jewish at all. And at the end, the test showed that she was Jewish. And at the end, there was a actual documental proof that she was Jewish. So this was quite a very, very monumental case. It's interesting that, just to give you to sign off on this particular story, caused a real unification of the family. And the couple themselves, the young boy and his wife, who now found out she was Jewish, they started to become much closer to Yiddishkeit. They started to really embrace Yiddishkeit. The family had a reunion in Paris, and was reunited, and was a very, very big thing for everybody. Since then, they had another set of twins, and they circumcised them, giving them Jewish names. They're giving the kids a Jewish education. They make Kiddush Havdalah, and they're slowly coming close to become Yidden who keep Torah mitzvahs. So this, just see how much time I have. Since then, we're talking about already 2.5 years went by since that time. We're able to, I mean, on one hand, the usage of this particular method became much more used than before, including many Botadin and Eretz Yisrael started to use it. Obviously, they use it together with other evidence. You have to know exactly. We still don't use it as the only evidence. That was, we need to have what's called raglaim ledover, a prior knowledge and a prior some kind of reasons why we believe the person is Jewish. But ultimately, there are many, many interesting cases we had since then. I'll give you an example. A gentleman from Philadelphia contacted me, and he says that he was adopted at birth, and he was adopted by a Jewish family. And since then, he is tortured by doubts whether he was told by the agency, the adoption agency, that he is Jewish, and he was able to identify his biological father status and also his biological mother's father status, but his biological mother's mother status he wasn't able to identify. And he was literally had no other agenda. He didn't have any other reasons why he wanted to be accepted as a Jew. I spoke to him on Skype. It was before Zoom days. He was sitting there with his back, at the back of him full of Sfarim. He was a person who became a very frum individual, but he was really plagued by doubts whether or not he's a Yid. And I offered him to, because I looked at what he had and I saw that he basically went through every single way to be able to find his mother's identity, and he went as far as he could. we couldn't help him anymore as far as any evidence is concerned. When I offered him to take the test, he agreed, and I sent it to a shliach in his city. And sure enough, he was one of the 4 of the families that we spoke about. And then many interesting stories happened since then. But at the same time, there was also a lot of politics. As this particular method became more and more used and became more famous, automatically it created more politics. That's what happens in Israel always. It creates politics. So there was an organization called ITIM, who convinced Avigdor Lieberman that this particular method is only used to make the life of Russian Jews more difficult. And while until now they were tortured and investigated and interrogated to make sure they're Jewish, now they're going to put them through another test and needlessly embarrass and humiliate them. That was how they presented it. They also started to spread the particular notion that this particular method will also disqualify Jews who are halachic Jews and always known as Jews, and suddenly they will do a test, and the test will show that they have no Jewish DNA. Now, on both grounds, it's a mistaken suggestion, because on one hand, this test is not meant to suggest at all that anybody who doesn't possess a Jewish DNA or match to one of the families that are exclusively Jewish, it doesn't come to suggest that the person is non-Jewish. Even today, when it went up, it's now 50% of Ashkenazi Jews were able to match to families that are exclusively Jewish and able to say that, yeah, to certify them. What happened to the other 50%? The other 50%, first of all, is families which are not yet investigated. At the moment, I'm working with a Simanim Institute in Eretz Yisrael, and my friend Rabbi Litka went almost full-time into this particular area. And every person that we test, since then we tested hundreds of people both in Australia and overseas, we get a kit, a DNA kit sent to them, or not to them, but to a rabbi that we rely on to be the mashgiach. And they come to the rabbi, and in front of him, they will test, they will do a swab with a brush and put it into a little flask, a little container with chemicals that preserve the DNA. We seal it and label it, and we ship it to the lab in Eretz Yisrael. And we get results now within a week and a half. At the moment, like I said before, they're doing a lot of research on Ashkenazi Jews and also Sephardi Jews. The Ashkenazi Jews, they reached 50% mark. They can now match 50% of Ashkenazi Jews to families that are exclusively Jewish. Within another year, if they have enough funds, they'll be able to go up to 70%, which is almost as good as we want, because you can never go to 100%, because once you get to 100%, it means you're disqualifying other Jews. You understand? It's never the case. So what happens to the other 50% at the moment? Some of them are the families we haven't yet discovered, which will be discovered in the next year, for example. But then you have a certain percentage that came from Gerim. We know that while there were very few converts in the Middle Ages, there were thousands and thousands of Gerim in the times of Bais Sheni, especially towards the end of Bais Sheni. When we hear in the Gemara about Unkel Sager and about Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Akiva, Shmai, Aftalion, this is just a few examples. It's a known fact, historical fact, that the amount of Gerim that joined the Jewish people, and even more that wanted to join, it says many didn't want to join because they were afraid of bris milah. The men didn't want to circumcise themselves, but so many joined us. So today you can have and we have tested some people from very miyuchazdika families who have on both fathers and mother sides, Rabbonim and Gdolim and everything else, and they can have very non-Jewish DNA. If they would have to prove the Jewishness, they would have a hard time. But Baruch Hashem, they don't have to, because this DNA test is not meant to at all disqualify anybody. And that's a very, very, it was a libel in order to somehow undermine this particular method. Avigdor Lieberman actually took this, the usage of DNA by Botadini, took it to the High Court of Israel with the argument that it's going to cause problems and so on and so forth. And it was rejected by the secular judges, who saw very clearly that it doesn't make sense. The premise that he's trying to bring in doesn't make sense. They saw that this particular method is used purely to be able to help and not at all to do the opposite. It will never do any adverse effect. And not only that, it's only offered to people who cannot prove the Jewishness, and they accept that particular suggestion very thankfully, because for them it's an opportunity to be able to prove the Jewishness. I just heard of the case recently from my friends. We always share our cases. So there was a case recently of a lady who came to prove a Jewishness in 1994 approximately, based in Israel. And they found a forgery in her documents. She forged documents. In Russia, it's possible to find a way to forge it. And actually find her, she was fined 7,000 shekel. Now, this year, her daughter wants to get married, and a lady came back to Besden, and she said, listen, I don't care what anybody said, it's true, I forged my documents, but we are Jewish. And they got a DNA test, and they are Jewish. They won't get the fine back because she still forged documents. It's still considered to be, she did try to lie to the court. But nevertheless, we see that today before she did it out of desperation because she couldn't prove her Jewishness, and now she was able to do it with this particular DNA test. So we see over here that it's another example how modern science cannot be used in a vacuum. You can't come along and say, look, we have a new technique and therefore we're going to use it indiscriminately. But once it's something that has a yesod, foundation in Shas and Poskim, in Torah, you can, we can see how everything's in Torah, how you can find the most modern techniques and methods that were not available until now, but you can see that the principles still exist in the precedents that we can find a connection with, and therefore these methods can be used and to assist and enhance our lives only if we're able to work hard and find how the connection between them and those Yesodis, those foundations in Torah. So having said that, if there's any questions?
Yes, I'd like to ask a question.
Yeah.
You mentioned the four mothers. When did these four mothers live, and how did we know that they were Jewish?
Those four mothers lived approximately 1,000 years ago in Rhine. Probably what happened was that when Rabbeinu Klonimus, who preceded the Rishonim, when him and his family moved from Italy to Germany, which was known at the time as Rhine, that was the beginning of Ashkenazi Jewry. And geneticists are able to identify through DNA, because they have access to DNA of families living in those times. They're able to identify and